Some stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with the silence that follows it, and sometimes that silence is louder than thunder. October wind moved through Montana pines like the breath of something ancient and indifferent, carrying the smell of coming snow and the faint sound of a child's breathing, short and broken and tired. Lily Morgan sat with her back against rough bark, the chain around her left wrist biting into skin, already bruised from earlier attempts to pull free. 8 years old, and she'd learned not to cry anymore. Tears only made Brandon angrier. The trailer behind her leaked yellow light through a cracked window, illuminating the rusted propane tank and the overflowing garbage bags Brandon hadn't bothered to take to the dump in 3 months. Pinewood sat 3 miles east down Highway 93, close enough that Lily could see the glow of the street lights, when the wind cleared the trees far enough that no one heard anything that happened at the end of this dirt road where the forest pressed close and swallowed sound. Her stomach twisted with hunger. Brandon had forgotten to feed her before locking the chain, too focused on the whiskey bottle and whatever poison he'd been smoking that made his eyes go strange and empty. 6 hours now, maybe more. The cold had worked its way through her thin t-shirt and into her bones, making her teeth chatter, despite her efforts to stay quiet. Quiet meant good. Brandon liked things quiet. Inside the trailer, country music played too loud, something about heartbreak and drinking alone. Lily closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's voice before Brandon came into their lives, back when Claire still hummed while brushing Lily's hair back, when laughter existed in their house like a bird that hadn't yet learned the shape of its cage. Those memories felt distant, now worn thin from too much handling, like photographs left in sunlight until the colors fade to nothing. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the trailer's circle of light, an owl called out once and fell silent. Lily's wrist throbbed where the metal had scraped away skin. She'd stopped trying to free herself after the first hour, after realizing that struggling only made the pain worse, and brought Brandon to the window to yell threats about what would happen if she didn't stay still and shut up. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, indifferent to the small humans suffering beneath them. Lily had counted them earlier, trying to distract herself from the ache in her bladder and the way her fingers had gone numb. She'd gotten to 47 before losing track, before her mind started drifting into that gray space between awake and unconscious, where time stopped meaning anything. Her mother was working the night shift at Betty's Diner 30 miles away in Kalispell, slinging coffee and eggs to truckers who tipped in crumpled singles. Claire wouldn't be home until dawn. By then, Brandon would have unlocked the chain, would have warned Lily not to say anything about it, would have reminded her that telling stories got little girls sent away to places worse than this. And Lily would nod and stay quiet because she'd learned that survival meant swallowing truth like broken glass. 2 years ago, before Brandon Webb walked into Betty's Diner and ordered coffee with a smile that made Claire blush, life had been different, not perfect. Chad Morgan had died when Lily was 6, crushed under scaffolding at a construction site outside Billings, leaving Claire with a mortgage she couldn't afford and a daughter who asked too many questions about where Daddy went. But there'd been safety then, predictability. Claire had worked 2 jobs, and they'd eaten mac and cheese 4 nights a week, and it had been enough. Then Brandon appeared with his promises and his charm and his willingness to fix the leaking roof and pay for groceries when money got tight. Claire had been so tired, bone-deep exhausted from carrying everything alone, and Brandon had seemed like an answer to prayers she'd stopped believing anyone heard. He moved in after 3 months, brought his tools and his motorcycle, and his easy laugh that made Claire smile again, for the first time since Chad died. The change happened gradually, so slowly that by the time Claire noticed, it was too late to unmake the choices that had led them here. First came the suggestions about Helen, Claire's sister, how she was always judging them, always offering opinions nobody asked for. Then came the checking of Claire's phone, casual at first, just curious about who she'd been talking to. Then the first shove explained away as an accident. He'd been drinking and didn't mean it. Baby, you know I love you. Lily had watched her mother shrink over 18 months, had seen the way Claire stopped calling. Helen stopped going to church, stopped existing anywhere except the narrow spaces Brandon allowed. The opioid prescription had come after Claire hurt her back, moving furniture, and Brandon had made sure the pills never quite ran out, made sure Claire stayed dependent on him for everything, including the medication that kept the pain at bay and the thoughts quiet. The first time Brandon hit Lily, it was because she'd left toys in the hallway and he'd tripped coming home drunk at 3 in the morning. Just a slap across the face, hard enough to make her ear ring for 2 days. Claire had been working a double shift, When Lily tried to tell her mother the next day, Claire's eyes went distant, and she'd murmured something about accidents happening, about being more careful about how Brandon was under a lot of stress, and they all needed to try harder. After that, the violence escalated according to its own logic. Brandon pushed Lily into walls when she talked back, locked her in the bedroom closet for hours when she forgot to do dishes, twisted her arm behind her back until she cried, and then slapped her for crying, for being weak, for making him lose his temper. Each incident eroded a little more of Lily's belief that adults protected children, that mothers chose their daughters over men who brought pain wrapped in excuses. Tonight had started because Lily had asked Brandon for help with homework, had interrupted his drinking to ask about multiplication tables. He'd looked at her with those empty eyes and told her to go outside and think about how to be less annoying. When she'd hesitated, he'd grabbed the chain from his toolbox, the one he used for towing disabled trucks, and dragged her out the back door. The lock had clicked shut around her wrist with a sound like the closing of something final. 6 hours ago, maybe 7 now. Time stretched strange when pain and cold and fear mixed together in the dark. Lily's mind drifted toward sleep despite the discomfort, exhaustion finally overwhelming everything else. She was almost gone. Consciousness fading to gray when a new sound cut through the night. Distant at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but growing steadily louder. The rumble of engines, multiple engines rolling through the valley with the deep thunder of heavy machinery moving fast. She lifted her head, weakly matted hair sticking to her tear-streaked face, eyes widening as light flickered through the trees. Headlights, more than one cutting through darkness, like searchlights hunting for something lost. The rumble deepened until it became a heartbeat of steel and chrome shaking the ground beneath her. On Highway 93, 3 miles from the trailer, where a child sat chained to a tree, 12 motorcycles cut through the October night. Iron Thunder Motorcycle Club, Pinewood chapter, returning from a veterans charity ride in Kalispell, where they'd raised $6,000 for homeless vets and stayed too late drinking coffee and swapping stories with men who understood that some scars never showed on skin. Jackson Cross Road Point, his gray braid whipping in the wind beneath his helmet, his body moving with the Harley's rhythm like they were parts of the same organism. 54 years old, and he'd been riding since he was 16, since the day he'd walked away from a father who solved problems with fists and a mother too broken to intervene. The Marines had given him structure and purpose, and a wife named Jennifer who'd understood why he woke up screaming from dreams he couldn't talk about. Emily had been born 2 years after he left the service, perfect and tiny, and the reason Jackson learned that love could be stronger than rage. 12 years since the drunk driver had taken them both. 12 years since Jackson had stood in a cemetery watching 2 coffins lowered into frozen ground while snow fell and his hands clenched into fists, and something inside him had hardened into a promise. No more innocent people would suffer on his watch if he could prevent it. Not ever again. Behind him, Tessa Martinez rode with the precision of someone who'd learned motorcycles in Afghanistan, where she'd spent 3 tours as a combat medic, patching holes in soldiers too young to vote. Blade they called her because she was sharp and dangerous and didn't tolerate bullshit from anyone. 38 and scarred inside and out, survivor of a relationship that had taught her what men could do when they stopped seeing women as human. She'd found Iron Thunder after leaving the Army, found brothers who respected the word, no, found purpose in protecting people who needed it. 11 others followed in formation, their headlights creating a river of illumination that pushed back the darkness. Doc Rivers, 61, who'd been a field medic in Vietnam and still woke up tasting jungle rot and hearing mortars. Hammer, 45, explosives expert, who'd turned those skills toward construction after his Navy discharge. Ghost, 33, who spoke rarely but showed up always. Axel, 29, youngest member, still learning that being part of something larger than yourself meant sacrifice. They'd been riding for 2 hours, taking the long way home because the October night was clear and cold and perfect for burning gasoline and clearing heads. The clubhouse sat another 10 miles north, a renovated warehouse that smelled of motor oil and coffee, decorated with military patches and photographs of members who'd earned their place through action, not words. Jackson raised his hand, suddenly slowing. The convoy obeyed instantly, 12 bikes dropping speed in synchronized precision. In the sudden quiet with engines idling and wind the only sound, Jackson turned his head toward the tree line. Something, not an animal, not wind, something that made the hair on his neck stand up, that triggered instincts older than language. Blade pulled alongside, her dark eyes scanning the forest. She'd heard it too. A sound like whimpering, like something small and hurt, trying not to make noise because noise meant pain. They'd both heard it before in different contexts, in places where suffering was expected. But this was Montana. This was supposed to be safe. This was home. Jackson cut his engine. The others followed suit, 12 motorcycles falling silent one by one until the night pressed close. He dismounted, boots hitting asphalt, and pulled the flashlight from his saddlebag. Blade and 4 others joined him, leaving 7 to guard the bike's standard protocol when something felt wrong. They moved through underbrush without speaking, flashlight beams cutting through mist that had risen from the forest floor. The smell of pine mixed with something sour, something that spoke of neglect and human habitation, gone wrong. 50 yards into the trees, Jackson's beam found a trailer sitting in a clearing, its aluminum siding streaked with rust, its windows covered with blankets. And behind it, silhouetted against a tree trunk, a shape too small to be anything but a child. Jackson's flashlight swept over Lily and stopped. She flinched, raising one hand to shield her eyes, her other arm extended behind her at an unnatural angle. The chain glinted in the beam metal wrapped around her wrist and secured to the tree with a padlock that looked like it belonged on a storage unit. Every muscle in Jackson's body went rigid. Beside him, Blade's breathing changed, became controlled and dangerous, the sound of someone forcing down rage, because rage clouded judgment and the situation required clarity. Doc moved forward slowly, medic instincts overriding everything else, already assessing visible injuries and calculating treatment protocols. Lily's voice came out as a whisper, damaged and desperate. "Please, don't tell him I was loud." The words hit Jackson like shrapnel. He'd heard similar pleas before in different accents, in different languages, always carrying the same message. "This is normal for me. This is what I deserve. Please don't make it worse." He knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and let the flashlight beam drift away from her face. His voice came out low and gentle despite the fury building in his chest. "No one's going to hurt you, sweetheart. We're here to help." Lily stared at him with eyes too old for her face, eyes that had learned not to trust promises from adults. But something in Jackson's expression must have reached her, because she didn't pull away when Blade knelt beside her with a multi-tool, didn't flinch when Doc draped a thick jacket over her shoulders. The metal resisted at first, the padlock too solid to break without tools they didn't carry. Blade worked the chain connection instead, finding the weak link, applying pressure with steady hands, until something gave with a sharp crack. When Lily felt the chain loosen and fall away, her breath hitched, like she didn't quite believe freedom was real. Jackson reached out slowly, telegraphing the movement, and when she didn't object, he helped her to her feet. She swayed, legs stiff from hours in one position, and Doc caught her other side. Behind them, Hammerhat appeared with a thermos of coffee from his saddlebag, still warm from the diner where they'd stopped an hour ago. Ghost had a blanket, standard emergency gear every member carried. They wrapped Lily in warmth and gave her small sips of coffee while Doc examined her wrist by flashlight, noting bruising that spoke of previous restraints, documenting injuries that would matter in whatever came next. Jackson's eyes moved from Lily to the trailer, visible through the trees. Light still flickered in the windows. Someone was home. Someone had chained this child to a tree and left her in the October cold for hours, and was currently inside doing whatever people did when they'd committed atrocities, and felt no urgency to check on their victims. He looked at Lily, at the way she held herself, small and quiet, at the bruises mapping her arms in shades of purple and yellow and green. Old injuries, new injuries, a pattern written on skin that told a story Jackson knew too well from his own childhood, from the years he'd learned to flinch before his father's hand connected to apologize, before being told what he'd done wrong. His voice stayed gentle, but carried an edge, now controlled fury leaking through. "Where do you live?" Lily pointed toward the trailer with a hand that trembled. The porch light flickered like it was running on failing wiring and borrowed time. Jackson could see shadows moving behind the blanket-covered windows. "He's inside." Her whisper barely carried over the wind. "Brandon." The name came out like poison, like saying it aloud might summon something terrible. Jackson stood slowly, rain beginning to fall in cold drops that promised worse to come. Thunder rolled across the valley, the kind of storm that built fast in Montana and hit hard. He looked at Blade, at Doc, at the others who gathered around this child they'd found by accident or fate or whatever force moved through the universe, arranging collisions between people who needed saving and people capable of doing the saving. His next question came even softer than before. "He do this to you?" Lily nodded, tears welling, despite her obvious effort to be brave. Jackson could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the learned response that admitting to abuse meant worse consequences than staying silent. But something in his face, or maybe in the way these leather-clad strangers had approached with gentleness instead of threat, cracked her defenses. "Said I was bad. Said Mom would understand." For a second, Jackson didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't acknowledge the way Emily's face superimposed itself over Lily's 8 years old, and trusting that her father would protect her, would keep the drunk drivers away, would prevent the semi-truck from running the red light at 60 miles per hour. He'd failed Emily, failed Jennifer, failed to be there when it mattered because he'd been 3 states away at a reunion he'd thought was important. He wouldn't fail this child. His voice came out like gravel sliding under pressure. "Stay with her." Blade understood immediately. She moved to Lily's side, her presence simultaneously protective and ready for violence if required. Doc positioned himself where he could monitor the trailer while keeping Lily in sight. The others spread out in tactical positions without being told, the old military instincts kicking in, securing the perimeter, and preparing for complications. Jackson turned toward the trailer, walking with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned that rushing into situations got people killed. Hammer and Ghost fell in behind him, silent backup witnesses to whatever happened next. Thunder rolled again, closer now, and the first fat raindrops began falling in earnest. Inside the trailer, Brandon Webb sprawled across a couch held together with the duct tape and delusion, a bottle dangling from fingers too drunk to maintain their grip. The television painted his face in shifting colors, some old Western, where good guys wore white hats and justice arrived on schedule. He'd forgotten about the kid chained outside, or maybe he just didn't care, too focused on the comfortable numbness that came from mixing whiskey with whatever pills he'd bought from his dealer that afternoon. 32 years old, and Brandon had learned early that consequences were for other people, that his father's badge and connections meant he could break women and walk away, that violence was simply a tool for maintaining control over people too weak to fight back. 3 restraining orders in 2 states sealed juvenile record assault charges that evaporated when witnesses suddenly changed their stories. His father had taught him well. The law protected men who knew how to work the system. He didn't notice the door opening, didn't register the presence filling his peripheral vision until it was too late to do anything but blink in confused recognition that something had changed. Jackson stood in the doorway, water dripping from his leather jacket, his expression carved from stone and old promises. Behind him, Hammer and Ghost materialized like avenging shadows. Brandon's alcohol-soaked brain struggled to process the intrusion. He sat up, fumbling, reaching for the cigarette that had burned down to ash on the coffee table cluttered with beer cans and pornography magazines and the detritus of a life lived without conscience. Who the hell? Jackson stepped inside before Brandon could finish his boots, leaving dark prints on linoleum that hadn't been mopped since Claire stopped having the energy to care. The smell hit him like a physical blow, beer and unwashed bodies and something chemical that spoke of drug use. His eyes swept the room, cataloging evidence, and landed on the rusted chain coiled beside an empty plate crusted with food dried to ceramic hardness. His voice came out quiet, dangerous, the tone of someone who'd learned that real threats didn't need volume. "No, we got the right one." The silence that followed pulsed with violence, held on a leash. Brandon's confusion morphed into something that might have been fear if he'd been sober enough to process danger accurately. He stood swaying, trying to project authority in his own home, trying to convince himself that leather jackets didn't mean these men could hurt him. "Who are you people?" Jackson's response carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Her guardian angels." For the words fully registered, Brandon lunged forward, fists swinging with the clumsy aggression of someone who'd learned to fight against people smaller and weaker than himself. The blow never landed. Blade appeared from behind Jackson and caught Brandon's wrist mid-air, twisting with mechanical precision, not enough to break it, but enough to make him scream. The sound got swallowed by thunder that rattled windows. Brandon stumbled back, eyes wide now, alcohol haze evaporating as survival instincts finally kicked in. These weren't people to bluff. These were professionals who moved like they'd seen violence and returned it with interest. He tried to back toward the bedroom where he kept the shotgun, but Ghost blocked that path with crossed arms and an expression that promised broken bones if Brandon tried going through him. Jackson stepped closer until they were inches apart, until Brandon could smell leather and rain and something else. Something that might have been righteousness aged in grief. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous for its softness. You like hurting people who can't fight back. You chain a child to a tree and call yourself a man. Brandon spat on the floor. Defiance, even in fear, the last gasp of someone who'd spent his entire life getting away with cruelty. Ain't your business. Jackson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air. Some threshold crossed. Hammer moved to the corner and flipped off the television. The room dimmed to just the pale light of lightning flashing through the window. Rain pounded the roof, now a steady drumbeat that would mask whatever sounds came next. It became my business when she whispered your name through a busted lip. They didn't beat him at once. They let him feel at first the coldness of linoleum against his knees when Jackson forced him down with pressure that spoke of training and practice and certainty. The weight of his own chain pressed into his palm when Blade handed it to him. Symbol and prophecy. The particular terror of realizing that the universe had decided to balance scales, that every action creates equal and opposite reaction, that sometimes justice arrives wearing leather instead of robes. Jackson looped the chain around Brandon's wrists, not too tight, just enough to remind him what helplessness felt like. You like chains? Then you'll remember this one. What followed wasn't sadistic. It was measured, proportional. For every bruise on Lily's arms, Brandon received 2. For the hours she'd spent in the cold, he spent minutes experiencing fear that stretched into subjective eternity. They didn't break bones because permanent damage wasn't the goal. Understanding was the goal. Making sure this man's body remembered what his conscience had forgotten, that hurting children carries consequences, that immunity ends when the right people stop looking away. When Brandon gasped for air through split lips, Jackson crouched beside him, close enough to smell the whiskey and fear sweat. That pain, that's not punishment, that's understanding. That's you learning what she felt. And if you ever breathe her name again, we'll finish what hell started. Outside, the sound of an approaching engine cut through the rain. Headlights swept across the trailer's exterior. Blade had called the sheriff from the forest, given terse coordinates, requested ambulance for an 8-year-old victim of long-term abuse. Standard protocol. They weren't vigilantes. They were citizens performing emergency intervention until proper authorities arrived. Jackson stood his boots, splashing through puddles of spilled beer. Brandon slumped against the wall, trembling, the chain now locked around his own ankles. Poetic symmetry that would play well or poorly depending on who told the story. The door swung open and wind howled in, bringing cold rain and flashing lights and the complicated machinery of official response. Sheriff Tom Brennan stepped inside, hand instinctively near his holster, taking in the scene with eyes that had witnessed 30 years of human nature at its worst. He saw Brandon first bloodied and chained, then saw Jackson standing calm in the center of chaos, leather jacket dark with rain. Their eyes met, old recognition flickered. They knew each other from another life, from years when Brennan had been a deputy and Jackson had been new to Pinewood, and they'd both understood that sometimes the letter of the law conflicted with its spirit. Brennan's voice came tight, professional, aware that how he handled the next minutes would matter. What happened here? Jackson's response carried no defensiveness, just simple statement of fact. Found a girl in chains. She's safe now. Ambulance coming. 10 minutes out. And him, Jackson glanced at Brandon without expression. Guess he tripped over his conscience. The joke landed flat but served its purpose. Brennan's jaw worked silently, processing implications, calculating how to write a report that acknowledged reality without creating problems he couldn't solve. He'd seen the Morgans around town, had noticed Claire's deterioration, had filed away concerns about the boyfriend without evidence solid enough to act on. Now evidence was bleeding on the floor, and he'd have to explain why official channels had failed where civilians succeeded. He moved closer to Jackson, voice dropping. His father's Marcus Webb. Used to be on the force before internal affairs got him. Marcus still has friends in the department. This ain't over, Reverton. Jackson nodded acknowledgement. He'd known the moment would come when saving a life meant exposing himself to retaliation. But some things mattered more than safety. Some promises to dead daughters required keeping, regardless of cost. I know what I signed up for. Brennan looked at him a moment longer, then turned to Brandon and began reading rights from a card he had memorized 20 years ago. Behind them, paramedics arrived, and the trailer filled with official voices asking questions and documenting injuries and beginning the process of transforming personal crisis into administrative procedure. Jackson walked out into the rain. The storm had peaked and was beginning to pass clouds breaking apart to reveal stars again. Doc stood with Lily in the clearing, her small form wrapped in his jacket, her eyes tracking Jackson's approach. When he reached her, she looked up with an expression that carried too much hope for someone so young, too much need to believe that adults could be trusted. After all, Blade appeared from where she'd been coordinating with paramedics, her face grim. They want to take her to Mountain View Hospital in Kalispell, standard protocol for this level of abuse. They'll hold her overnight for observation, bring in CPS in the morning. Jackson knelt so he was level with Lily, rain running down his face, his voice gentle despite everything. The ambulance is going to take you somewhere safe. Doctors will check you over. Make sure you're okay. Your mom will meet you there. Lily's grip tightened on Doc's jacket. He won't come back. Brandon won't come back. The question hit harder than Brandon's drunken swing had. Jackson held her gaze, making sure she understood he wasn't lying, wasn't offering false comfort. Brandon's going to jail for a long time. He won't hurt you again. That's a promise. Are you really angels? The whisper carried childhood's last attempt to believe in magic, to make sense of salvation that had arrived on motorcycles instead of wings. Jackson's smile came faint, sad, weighted with years of knowing that he was just a man flawed and failing more often than succeeding. Nah, sweetheart, just men who got tired of watching the devil win. He stood as paramedics approached with a gurney they'd modified into something less intimidating for a child victim. Lily went without resistance, shock beginning to set in now that adrenaline was fading her body, finally understanding that the immediate danger had passed. They loaded her into the ambulance with care, and Doc climbed in without being asked his medic training, making him the logical choice to stay with her during transport. Jackson watched the ambulance pull away, red lights painting the forest in emergency colors. Behind him, the others had gathered, 12 men bound by shared experience and commitment to principles that didn't always align with legal technicalities. They'd all served in places where official authority failed, where saving lives meant breaking rules, where the choice between doing right and doing legal wasn't a choice at all. Brennan approached as his deputies finished processing Brandon, loading him into the sheriff's SUV with hands cuffed behind his back and threats spilling from his bloodied mouth. The sheriff's expression carried exhaustion and something that might have been respect or might have been frustration, hard to tell in the flashing lights. You know what you started tonight? Marcus Webb is going to come at you with everything. Civil suits, criminal charges, every connection he's got. And between an ex-cop and a motorcycle club, courts know who they believe. Jackson's response came without hesitation. Then we'll deal with it. But that little girl's alive, and he's in custody. Everything else is just paperwork. Brennan shook his head slowly. You're too damn stubborn for your own good cross. Probably, but I'm not wrong. They stood in silence a moment, rain tapering to drizzle, the storm moving east toward valleys that wouldn't appreciate its arrival. Brennan pulled out his notebook, resigned to doing the job, regardless of personal feelings. Need statements from all of you, and I'm going to tell you right now, be careful what you say. Anything you admit to can and will be used. Jackson understood the warning beneath the official language. Brennan was offering him a chance to craft narrative carefully, to frame events in ways that minimize legal exposure. It was a kindness from someone who'd seen enough gray areas to know that justice and law weren't always synonyms. We'll come to the station tomorrow. Give you time to process the scene tonight. Brennan nodded and walked away, leaving Jackson standing in the clearing with his brothers, all of them processing what they'd done and what it would cost. Blade moved to his side, her voice carrying concern she rarely showed. Marcus Webb's going to make this ugly. You ready for that fight? Jackson looked at where the ambulance had disappeared down the highway, carrying a child who'd been seconds from hypothermia, who'd learned tonight that strangers could be kinder than family, that safety sometimes arrived in unexpected forms. He thought about Emily, about 12 years of wishing he could turn back time, about the promise he'd made, standing in a cemetery while snow fell and his world ended. I've been ready for this fight my whole life. Just didn't know it until tonight. They rode back to Pinewood in formation 12 motorcycles cutting through post-storm darkness, their engines the only sound besides wind in the pines. Jackson's mind was already moving ahead, calculating what came next. Brandon would be arraigned likely within 48 hours. Claire would have to decide whether to support the man who'd hurt her daughter or finally break free of whatever hold he had over her. CPS would investigate, determine whether Lily could go home or needed foster placement. And Marcus Webb would activate his network of former cops and dirty lawyers and make everyone's life complicated. But for tonight, a child was safe. For tonight, justice had arrived before it was too late. For tonight, the devil hadn't won. They pulled into the clubhouse parking lot at 1 in the morning, exhausted and wired adrenaline still humming through veins. Inside, the space smelled like it always did: motor oil and coffee leather and chrome polish, the accumulated scent of men who'd found brotherhood when civilian life had failed to provide it. The walls were decorated with patches from other chapters, photographs of members past and present, flags from countries where they'd served and bled. Jackson called an emergency meeting. 12 men gathered around the scarred oak table that had witnessed every major decision. The chapter made their faces serious in the overhead lights. He explained the situation without embellishment. They'd found an abused child. They'd intervened. There would be consequences. The question now was whether they stood together or whether anyone wanted out before things got complicated. The vote was unanimous. 12 hands raised, 12 men committing to whatever came next, accepting that doing the right thing sometimes meant paying prices you couldn't afford. It was what they'd signed up for when they'd put on those patches, when they'd sworn oaths about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Blade pulled Jackson aside after the meeting, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through similar situations and understood the stakes. "This is going to consume you, saving this kid. You know that, right?" Jackson did know. He'd known the moment he'd seen Lily chained to that tree, had felt Emily's ghost settle over his shoulder and whisper that this was the chance he'd been waiting for, the opportunity to make 12 years of grief mean something beyond private suffering. "I can live with that. Can you?" Because Marcus Webb isn't some drunk who'll take his beating and fade away. He's connected, vindictive. He'll try to destroy you to protect his son. And he'll use that kid as a weapon to make it happen. Jackson's jaw tightened. He understood the warning. Understood that becoming invested in Lily's welfare meant giving Marcus leverage, meant creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But he also understood that some things mattered more than tactical advantage, that walking away now would mean living with regret that made the past 12 years look easy by comparison. "Then we'll be ready when he comes. But I'm not leaving that kid to navigate this alone." Blade studied him a moment longer, then nodded. She'd make the same choice in his position. They all would. That's why they were here instead of living comfortable lives that required looking away from suffering. Some people were built to intervene. Some people couldn't sleep at night knowing they'd walk past someone who needed help. Jackson drove to Mountain View Hospital, arriving just before dawn. The building squatted on the edge of Kalispell, like a concrete promise that medicine could fix what violence broke. He found Doc in the emergency waiting area, drinking coffee that smelled like it had been brewed sometime last week and reheated until it achieved sentience. Lily was stable. Dehydration, mild hypothermia, extensive bruising, malnutrition, and the psychological trauma that wouldn't show on x-rays but would manifest in nightmares and trust issues for years to come. They were holding her for observation, running tests, documenting injuries that would become evidence in the criminal case against Brandon Webb. Claire had arrived an hour ago, Doc reported. She'd been incoherent with guilt and fear, barely able to look at her daughter, visibly withdrawing from whatever substances she'd been using to cope. A nurse had finally sedated her and put her in a room down the hall, away from Lily, giving everyone space to process the night's events. Jackson sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair that had been designed by someone who'd never experienced human anatomy, and waited. The sun rose outside, painting the parking lot in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene given what had transpired in darkness. Nurses changed shifts. Doctors made rounds. The hospital hummed with its usual rhythm of crisis and recovery, death and birth, all the human drama that filled these buildings 24 hours a day. At 6:47 in the morning, a social worker appeared, Emma Chen, 42, 16 years with Child Protective Services, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every variation of family dysfunction and retained capacity for surprise. She introduced herself with professional courtesy that barely masked assessment happening beneath every word. She needed to speak with Lily, needed to determine whether the child could return to her mother's care or required emergency foster placement. Standard protocol when children were present at violent scenes, when primary caregivers had demonstrated inability or unwillingness to protect them from harm. Jackson stood when she started toward Lily's room. She's been through enough. She doesn't need interrogation. Chen's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried steel. Mr. Stone, I understand your concern, but I have legal authority and responsibility here. Lily's welfare is my priority, and determining safe placement requires assessment I'm trained to provide. She's scared. She just spent 6 hours chained to a tree. Give her time. Time to what bond with strangers who assaulted her abuser? You're not family, Mr. Stone. You don't get input on CPS protocols. The words landed like accusations Jackson had been expecting, but hadn't prepared for. He'd saved Lily's life. He'd risked legal consequences to pull her from immediate danger. And now the system he'd bought time for was treating him like part of the problem instead of the solution. Before he could respond, Sheriff Brennan appeared in the waiting area looking like he'd been awake all night processing evidence and writing reports that would satisfy both truth and politics. His expression when he saw Jackson suggested this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. Need to talk to you about Brandon Webb's father. They moved to a corner where privacy was approximate, where other families couldn't overhear details that might alarm them. Brennan's voice stayed low professional, delivering information that would complicate everything. Marcus Webb showed up at the station 3 hours ago with a lawyer. He's filing assault charges against you and anyone else who touched his son. Civil suits coming to $500,000 in damages, and he's got connections with the DA's office cross. This is going to be ugly. Jackson had expected this, had calculated that saving Lily would cost him freedom, or money, or both. But hearing it confirmed an understanding that Marcus had moved fast to seize narrative control made the threat real in ways anticipation hadn't managed. Brandon chained an 8-year-old to a tree. We responded to a child in immediate danger. That's not assault. That's emergency intervention. Brennan's expression suggested he agreed, but agreement wasn't relevant to what came next. You'll have to prove that in court. And Marcus is going to argue you went too far, that you exceeded reasonable force, that your actions were retaliation, not rescue. He's going to paint you as vigilantes who used a child's suffering as excuse for violence. The strategy was obvious and potentially effective. Marcus would try to flip the narrative, make Jackson and Iron Thunder the villains, make Brandon the victim. If he succeeded, Brandon might walk on reduced charges while Jackson faced prison time. It was the kind of legal judo that happened when money and connections collided with justice's slower processes. Chen reappeared before Jackson could respond, her face tight with frustration. She'd just spoken with her supervisor, had been informed that Marcus Webb was already working channels to discredit the case against his son, already planting suggestions that Lily's injuries might have other explanations, that Claire's drug use made her an unreliable witness, that motorcycle club involvement suggested ulterior motives. This is going to get worse before it gets better. Marcus Webb is playing a longer game. He's not just trying to punish you. He's trying to discredit the case against Brandon. If he can prove you acted as vigilantes, he can argue Brandon's arrest was fruit of the poisonous tree. Brandon walks free. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jackson had saved Lily's life tonight. But by doing so, he might have given Marcus the ammunition needed to free Brandon, to put that monster back on the street where he could hurt more children, could finish what he'd started with Lily once legal proceedings resolved in his favor. Jackson looked through the waiting room window at the sunrise painting everything gold and false. He thought about Emily, about promises made in cemeteries, about the impossible arithmetic of trying to save people when the system designed to protect them had been corrupted from within. He thought about Lily, about whether she'd understand if he walked away now to preserve the legal case, whether she'd forgive him for abandoning her to navigate this alone. He couldn't walk away. Wouldn't. Some things mattered more than tactical advantage. Some promises couldn't be broken just because keeping them was hard. His voice came out quiet but certain. Then we'll fight. All of it. whatever Marcus throws at us. Because walking away means admitting that power wins, that kids like Lily don't matter when it's expensive to help them. I'm not admitting that, not ever. Brennan shook his head, but without judgment, without surprise. You're going to lose everything. Jackson smiled without humor. I lost everything 12 years ago. This is just learning to live with what's left. 72 hours. That's what Emma Chen gave Claire Morgan to demonstrate stable housing, employment, and support systems adequate for raising a traumatized child. 72 hours to prove she could be a mother instead of just someone who'd given birth and then chosen pills over protection, men over motherhood, comfortable numbness over difficult truth. Claire sat in a plastic chair identical to Jackson's, her hands shaking from withdrawal that made her bones ache and her skin crawl with invisible insects. 29 years old, and she looked 40, face hollowed by opioids and guilt in equal measure. Helen had driven in from Kalispell, her older sister appearing in the hospital corridor, like judgment, incarnate fury, and love, mixed so thoroughly that Claire couldn't tell where one emotion ended and the other began. Helen's first words carried 2 years of frustration finally unleashed. I told you he was dangerous. I begged you to leave. I offered you my house, my savings, everything. And you chose him. The words weren't wrong. Claire had chosen Brandon, had believed his promises that he'd change, that the violence was temporary stress, that medications would help, that leaving would be worse than staying. She'd made calculations in the fog of addiction and arrived at conclusions that had nearly killed her daughter. No amount of explanation would erase that math. I know. Her voice came out ruined, damaged by screaming and crying and the particular exhaustion of watching your life collapse in real time. I know what I did, what I didn't do. Helen's anger cracked, revealing devastation beneath. She grabbed Claire's shoulders, forcing eye contact, making sure the message landed. You don't get to know and do nothing. You don't get to sit here feeling sorry for yourself while Lily's down the hall with a social worker deciding if she's ever coming home. You want your daughter back. Prove you deserve her. The challenge hung between them, impossible and necessary. Claire understood that Helen wasn't offering comfort. She was offering a lifeline that Claire would have to grab with both hands and climb, using strengths she didn't possess and somehow find anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. Emma Chen emerged from Lily's room carrying a manila folder that would determine futures. Her assessment had taken 90 minutes, questions asked gently, but probing for truth beneath trauma. Lily had answered with remarkable clarity for someone so young, describing months of escalating violence, explaining how she'd learned to stay quiet and small and invisible, detailing the night Brandon had chained her to the tree because she'd interrupted his drinking. The social worker's expression gave nothing away. Professional mask maintained, even as her notes documented horrors that would keep her awake tonight. She approached Claire with the folder held against her chest like armor. Mrs. Morgan, we need to discuss your daughter's placement. The word placement hit like a fist. Not custody, not home, not family. Placement. The clinical term for when children became problems, requiring solutions when mothers failed so completely that bureaucracy had to intervene. Claire felt her sister's hand tighten on her shoulder, offering support Claire wasn't sure she'd earned. Chen continued without waiting for response. Lily's been through severe trauma. She requires stable environment, consistent care, and most importantly, protection from future harm. Given your relationship with Mr. Webb and your substance use history, I have concerns about your ability to provide those things. Helen stepped forward before Claire could collapse into apology and self-recrimination. Lily can stay with me. I've got a 2-bedroom house in Kalispell, steady employment, clean background. I'll take her as long as necessary. Chen made notes, pen moving across paper with strokes that turned conversation into permanent record. That's possible, but I'll need to conduct home inspection, verify employment, check references. And Mrs. Morgan, you'll need to complete substance abuse evaluation and treatment program. Until then, I'm recommending temporary placement with Ms. Helen Morgan with supervised visits only. The words temporary and supervised struck different notes, both painful in their own ways. Temporary suggested hope, possibility of reunion if Claire could prove herself worthy. Supervised meant every interaction would be monitored, documented, analyzed for signs that Claire remained a threat to her own child. It was mercy and punishment braided together justice that tasted like ash. Claire nodded because speaking would mean crying, and she'd already cried enough to fill the valley. Helen began discussing logistics with Chen, two practical women making arrangements for a child neither had protected adequately, despite one trying and the other failing. Claire watched them through withdrawal's haze and understood that her life had split into before and after, into the person who'd chosen wrong and the person who'd somehow have to learn choosing right. Jackson remained in the waiting area, witness to family dysfunction playing out in fluorescent lighting and hushed voices. He'd positioned himself where he could see Lily's door protective instinct overriding good sense or legal advice. When Chen finished with Claire and Helen, she approached him with the expression of someone preparing to deliver news that wouldn't be welcome. "Mr. Cross, I appreciate what you did last night. Finding Lily probably saved her life. But moving forward, you need to understand boundaries. You're not family, you're not legal guardian, and given the circumstances of Mr. Webb's injuries, your continued involvement could complicate the case against him." The warning came wrapped in professional courtesy but landed like threat. Jackson understood the subtext, back off, or risk becoming liability instead of asset. Make space for official channels or watch Marcus Webb use your good intentions to free his son. It was pragmatic advice born from experience, with cases where civilian intervention created more problems than it solved. He also understood it was advice he couldn't follow. Wouldn't. Some commitments couldn't be abandoned just because following through was inconvenient or dangerous. He'd made a promise to an 8-year-old girl that she was safe now, that monsters couldn't reach her anymore, and that promise required presence, not distance. "I hear you, Ms. Chen, but that little girl's going to need people who show up. I intend to be one of them." Chen's expression suggested she'd expected that response and had already prepared for complications it would bring. "Just be aware Marcus Webb's attorneys will use any connection between you and Lily to argue bias to suggest improper influence. The stronger your bond with her, the easier you make their case." Jackson had calculated that cost already, knew that caring about Lily meant giving Marcus ammunition, meant creating vulnerabilities that skilled lawyers would exploit without hesitation. But he'd spent 12 years wishing he could protect Emily, wishing he'd been there when the drunk driver ran that red light, and here was a child who'd survived when his daughter hadn't. Walking away would mean spitting on Emily's grave, admitting that her death taught him nothing about what mattered. Let them make their case. I'll make mine. Doc appeared then, having finished coordinating with hospital staff about Lily's discharge timeline. She'd be cleared to leave by afternoon, pending final medical clearance and CPS approval. He pulled Jackson aside, voice low enough that eavesdropping required obvious effort. "Claire's checking into Whitefish Recovery Center. 30-day inpatient program starting tomorrow. Helen's taking Lily home today, getting her settled before school starts back Monday." He paused, weighing whether to continue, then pushed ahead because honesty mattered more than comfort. "And Marcus Webb's already working the media. Local news is running stories about biker gang assault. You're the villain in his version." Jackson had anticipated that Marcus would control narrative, would use connections to plant stories that painted Brandon as victim and Iron Thunder as dangerous criminals. Public opinion mattered in cases like this, influenced everything from jury pools to judicial decisions. Marcus understood that legal battles were won before ever reaching courtroom, that shaping perception was as important as evidence. "Then we'll need to tell our side." Doc's skepticism showed in the set of his jaw. "You think anyone's going to listen? We're the motorcycle club. He's the ex-cop with respectable friends and a son who'll clean up nice for cameras. We lose that fight before it starts." Maybe, probably. But Jackson had learned in Iraq that losing battles didn't mean losing wars, that strategic defeat could create conditions for eventual victory if you maintained discipline and focus. Marcus had the advantage now. That would change when evidence emerged, when Lily testified, when the pattern of Brandon's violence became undeniable, even to those predisposed to dismiss bikers as troublemakers. They left the hospital as afternoon sun painted Kalispell in golden light that felt inappropriate given the circumstances. 12 motorcycles sat in the parking lot, chrome gleaming, Iron Thunder patches visible to anyone who cared to notice. Jackson had texted the chapter requesting presence, understanding that numbers mattered when power dynamics were being established. 12 men who'd served in places where violence was currency, understood the importance of showing up, of making clear that Lily had protection extending beyond one person. Helen emerged with Lily an hour later, the child wrapped in borrowed clothes that hung loose on her small frame. She'd been bathed and fed and examined, transformed from the terrified creature chained to a tree into something resembling a normal girl, except for the haunted quality in her eyes, the way she startled when a car door slammed in the distance, the death grip she maintained on Helen's hand. When Lily saw Jackson, her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something that suggested recognition. Memory of the voice that had promised safety in darknesses, of the presence that had represented rescue, when rescue seemed impossible. She pulled free from Helen and approached with the tentative movements of someone who'd learned that adults could transform from kind to cruel without warning. "You came back." Her whisper carried surprise and relief in equal measure. Jackson knelt so they were eye-level, aware of Chen watching from the hospital entrance, documenting this interaction for whatever reports would shape Lily's future. "Told you I would. I keep my promises." Lily studied his face, searching for tells that would indicate whether trust was justified or foolish. Whatever she saw must have satisfied some internal test, because she leaned forward and hugged him quickly before retreating to Helen's side, her comfort zone already established with the aunt, who represented safety through familiarity. Helen's expression when she looked at Jackson carried complexity he couldn't fully parse. Gratitude for saving Lily mixed with wariness about what his continued involvement might cost, curiosity about what motivated a stranger to insert himself into their family's catastrophe. She'd heard about motorcycle clubs from news stories and movies, none of which prepared her for the reality of 12 men standing respectfully beside polished bikes, waiting for nothing except confirmation that a child was okay. "Thank you. For last night. For finding her." The words came stiff, unpracticed, at accepting help from people she'd been taught to fear. Jackson stood, giving Lily space to process at her own pace. "She's a brave kid. Survived something no child should face. She's going to need time and patience and probably therapy, but she's going to be okay." Helen nodded, loading Lily into her sedan with gentle efficiency. Jackson watched them drive away, the child's face pressed against the rear window, tracking his position until distance made details impossible. Only when they disappeared did he acknowledge the weight settling across his shoulders, the recognition that saving Lily's life had been the easy part. Everything that came next would be harder, more complicated, requiring resources he wasn't certain he possessed. Blade approached her tactical assessment of the situation, written in the tension of her posture. "We need to talk about Marcus Webb and what's coming." They convened at the clubhouse, all 12 members gathering around the scarred table that had witnessed every major decision in the chapter's history. Linda Marsh, Jackson's attorney, joined them via speakerphone, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd spent the morning reviewing case law and calculating probabilities. Marcus Webb had filed civil suit seeking $500,000 in damages for assault, battery, and emotional distress. Criminal charges were pending, with the district attorney's office recommendations expected within a week. Marcus had also filed restraining order, preventing Jackson from contacting Brandon, a tactical move designed to complicate Jackson's ability to gather evidence for the defense. Linda's assessment was grim. Best case scenario, charges get dropped and civil suit settles for nuisance value. Worst case, Jackson faces 2 to 5 years prison time, and the chapter's assets get seized to pay judgment. Middle ground is probation, community service, and financial damages that hurt but don't destroy you. And the numbers hung in the air, cold and clinical, reducing human drama to economic calculation. Jackson understood that Marcus was using multiple pressure points, simultaneously attacking him from legal angles while also working media and political connections. It was sophisticated strategy from someone who'd spent 30 years learning how power operated in small Montana towns, where everyone knew everyone and old favors determined outcomes. Axel, the youngest member, broke the silence with the question others were thinking. "We should have called the cops first. Let them handle Brandon. Now we're exposed, and Marcus has ammunition." Ghost's response came quiet but firm. "That girl would have died before cops arrived. We did what needed doing." The debate that followed revealed fault lines Jackson had hoped wouldn't emerge. Some members worried that protecting Lily would destroy the chapter, that noble intentions didn't matter when lawyers and judges entered the equation. Others argued that walking away after making promises would mean abandoning everything Iron Thunder claimed to stand for. Jackson let them talk, understanding that consensus mattered, that forcing compliance would create resentment that festered. When they finally voted, the count came unanimous. 12 hands raised, 12 men recommitting to consequences they'd accepted last night in the moment between finding a chained child and deciding intervention mattered more than safety. It was what Jackson had expected, what he'd hoped for, but relief still flooded through him because leading alone was possible, but leading together was sustainable. Linda continued with additional complications. Emma Chen informed me that Marcus is working channels to discredit the case against Brandon. He's suggesting Claire's drug use makes her unreliable, that Lily's injuries could have other explanations, that your involvement indicates ulterior motives. He's building narrative where Brandon is flawed but not criminal, where you're dangerous vigilantes who exploited family crisis. The strategy was elegant and potentially effective. Marcus wasn't denying Brandon hurt Lily. He was reframing it as isolated incident, blown out of proportion by people with agendas as domestic situation that should have been handled through family counseling, not criminal prosecution. If he convinced the district attorney that pursuing charges would be complicated by Jackson's involvement, Brandon might accept plea deal resulting in probation rather than prison time. Jackson's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The thought of Brandon walking free, returning to Pinewood, potentially encountering Lily at grocery stores or school events, made rage build in his chest like pressure seeking release. But rage clouded judgment, and this situation required clarity. What do we need to do to make sure Brandon stays locked up? Linda's pause suggested the answer wouldn't be simple. You need to step back, minimize contact with Lily, stop inserting yourself into the investigation, let the system work without interference. The stronger the appearance of objectivity, the harder Marcus's job becomes. The advice was sound from legal perspective and impossible from human one. Jackson had promised Lily she was safe, had made eye contact with a terrified child, and committed to protection that didn't evaporate when lawyers got involved. Breaking that promise would mean becoming another adult who disappointed her, who proved that words were convenient lies rather than binding commitments. I can't do that. Linda's sigh carried frustration, born from years representing clients who prioritize principle over pragmatism. Then you need to accept that protecting this child might mean sacrificing your freedom. Marcus Webb will use every interaction, every gesture, every moment of kindness as evidence of improper influence. And when the civil suit goes to trial, your financial situation could become unsustainable. The meeting ended without resolution, just grim acknowledgement that the path forward involved navigating between legal necessity and moral obligation, between tactics that might work and values that couldn't be compromised. Jackson walked outside as the evening approached, the October sky bleeding orange and purple across mountains that had witnessed human drama for millennia and remained unmoved by any of it. Blade found him there, leaning against his Harley, staring at nothing. Her presence carried the particular comfort of someone who'd survived her own hell and understood that words rarely help, that sometimes companionship was enough. You're thinking about your daughter. Not a question. Blade had known Jackson long enough to read the tells the way his jaw tightened when Emily's ghost settled over his shoulder, the distance that crept into his eyes when present circumstances collided with past regrets. Lily's the same age Emily was. Same blonde hair, same way of looking at you like she's trying to figure out if you're safe. When I saw her chained to that tree for a second, it was Emily, and I couldn't fail again. Couldn't let another little girl suffer when I had power to stop it. Blade let that sit a moment before responding. You didn't fail Emily. Drunk driver killed her. You weren't even in the state. I should have been. Should have skipped the reunion, stayed home, been there to drive them, instead of letting Jennifer take their daughter alone. The math's simple. I chose wrong, they died, I lived. And now I've got a chance to choose right for someone else's daughter. The logic was flawed, but Jackson had built 12 years of guilt. On that foundation had constructed entire architecture of self-blame that rationality couldn't dismantle. Blade understood because she'd done similar mathematics around her own trauma, had spent years calculating how different choices might have prevented the abuse she'd endured, had only recently begun accepting that victim and volunteer weren't synonyms. Marcus Webb's going to come at you hard. He's going to try to paint you as unstable, as someone projecting grief onto inappropriate situations. He'll bring up Emily, use your pain as weapon. Jackson had anticipated that strategy, knew that Marcus would weaponize everything, would transform Jackson's greatest loss into evidence of unsound judgment, would argue that saving Lily had nothing to do with the child and everything to do with Jackson's unresolved trauma. It would be effective because it contained truth, because Jackson couldn't deny that Emily's death had shaped his response to finding another 8-year-old in danger. Let him. Doesn't change what happened. Doesn't change what Brandon did. And it doesn't change that Lily needed help and we provided it. The week that followed tested that conviction. Marcus Webb proved as dangerous as advertised, working connections with skill that spoke to decades navigating small-town power structures. Stories appeared in the Pinewood Gazette and Kalispell Chronicle, painting sympathetic portrait of Brandon's troubled man, struggling with addiction, trying to help girlfriend's daughter, making terrible mistake under influence, but fundamentally decent. The articles mentioned Jackson's military service, and Emily's death implied instability, suggested that Iron Thunder had history of violence that authorities were investigating. District Attorney Sarah Whitmore, 48, in facing re-election in 6 months, called a meeting with Linda Marsh to discuss the situation. Her office overlooked Pinewood's Main Street windows, providing view of the courthouse where Brandon's fate would be determined. Her expression when Linda arrived carried the particular weariness of prosecutors who'd learned that justice and politics intersected more often than law school suggested. I've reviewed the evidence. Medical reports on the child are damning. But Marcus Webb's raising questions I can't ignore. About proportionality of response, about whether your clients exceeded reasonable force, about whether this case is compromised by vigilante elements. Linda had prepared for this, had assembled counter-arguments emphasizing exigent circumstances and child protection imperatives. My clients found an 8-year-old girl chained to a tree in near-freezing temperatures. They called emergency services, provided first aid, and subdued an adult male who posed immediate threat. That's not vigilantism. That's civic duty. Whitmore's fingers drummed against her desk, unconscious, tell that she wasn't convinced, but wanted to be. The problem is Brandon Webb's injuries. Broken ribs, facial fractures, extensive bruising. That level of damage suggests retaliation rather than restraint. That level of damage suggests what was necessary to subdue an adult male who was actively resisting. My clients didn't shoot him, didn't permanently disable him, didn't exceed what reasonable person would consider appropriate given circumstances. The debate continued for an hour, Linda making arguments she'd refined over 3 decades practicing criminal defense in Montana, Whitmore pushing back with concerns that reflected political calculation as much as legal principle. The meeting ended without resolution, just agreement that Whitmore would present evidence to grand jury and let them decide whether charges against Jackson were warranted. Jackson learned about the grand jury hearing through Linda's terse phone call, her voice carrying frustration that came from recognizing when clients faced genuine jeopardy. Grand juries indicted in 99% of cases, rubber-stamping prosecutors' recommendations without serious scrutiny. But occasionally, when evidence was ambiguous or public opinion divided, grand juries actually deliberated. This would be one of those cases. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, giving both sides time to prepare. Marcus Webb hired Richard Carver, expensive defense attorney from Billings, known for aggressive tactics and willingness to bend ethical rules until they nearly broke. Carver filed motions requesting Jackson's military and medical records, seeking ammunition for arguments about PTSD and impaired judgment. Linda fought those motions but lost more than she won. Judge determining that Jackson's mental state was relevant to questions about excessive force. Pinewood divided over the situation like fault lines suddenly made visible. Father Miguel Torres, the Catholic priest who'd known Jackson for 10 years, spoke from his pulpit about Good Samaritans and moral obligation to intervene when children suffered. Betty, the diner owner who'd employed Claire and watched her deterioration, put up a sign declaring Iron Thunder members ate free because they'd done what the rest of town had been too cowardly to attempt. Doc Henshaw, the elderly physician who'd treated Lily's injuries, wrote editorial for the Gazette detailing medical evidence of long-term abuse and arguing that Jackson's actions had been heroic, not criminal. But opposition emerged equally vocal. Mayor Patricia Holden worried publicly about precedent, about what would happen when citizens decided to enforce their own justice rather than trusting official channels. School board members questioned whether motorcycle club members should be allowed near children whether Iron Thunder's presence at community events sent wrong messages about acceptable behavior. Some residents who'd always viewed the bikers with suspicion found their prejudices confirmed, found it easy to believe that leather-clad men who rode loud motorcycles were naturally inclined toward violence, regardless of circumstances. The town hall meeting 3 weeks before the grand jury hearing drew standing room only crowd. Jackson attended with his chapter understanding that absence would be interpreted as cowardice or guilt. They sat in the back 12 men in matching patches and listened while townspeople debated their character and motives for 90 contentious minutes. Jennifer Cole, mother of one of Lily's classmates, stood and addressed the crowd with voice that shook from emotion. My daughter told me Lily came to school with bruises for months. We all saw it. We all wondered. And not one of us did anything. Not one of us called CPS or confronted Claire or checked if that little girl was safe. These men found her chained to a tree, and they saved her life. So before we condemn them, maybe we should ask ourselves why they had to. Why we failed so completely that strangers on motorcycles provided the protection we should have offered. The applause that followed came from roughly half the room. The other half sat in stony silence, unwilling to concede that their inaction had contributed to Lily's suffering, that maintaining comfortable assumptions about who constituted threat had left a child vulnerable to the very people who should have protected her. Jackson didn't speak during the meeting. Neither did any of his brothers. They'd agreed beforehand that silence was tactical choice, that anything they said would be twisted by opponents or used as evidence by Marcus's legal team. But when the meeting ended and people filed out into the October night, several approached to shake hands, to murmur thanks, to express support that had to remain quiet because declaring allegiance to Motorcycle Club carried social costs some weren't willing to pay. Helen brought Lily to visit Jackson 2 days before the grand jury hearing, an act of defiance against Emma Chen's warnings about maintaining distance. They met at Riverside Park neutral territory, where surveillance seemed unlikely and conversation could happen without official documentation. Lily climbed out of Helen's sedan wearing new clothes that fit properly, hair brushed and clean and looking almost normal, except for the way she scanned surroundings, constantly checking escape routes, verifying that Brandon wasn't somehow approaching, despite being in county jail awaiting trial. Jackson knelt when she ran to him, letting her set the pace of contact, not presuming welcome just because he'd saved her life. She surprised him by hugging hard, small arms wrapping around his neck with desperate strength. Aunt Helen said you might go to jail because you saved me. The accusation in her voice wasn't directed at Jackson, but at a universe cruel enough to punish people for doing right. He pulled back so he could see her face, so she could read his expression and understand he wasn't lying or sugarcoating truth. Maybe. There's a hearing where people will decide if I broke laws by helping you. Whatever they decide, I want you to know, saving you was right. I'd do it again. And if I have to go away for a while because of it, that's okay. You are worth it. Lily's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back since leaving the hospital, since learning that the world punished kindness as often as it rewarded cruelty. It's not fair. You're good. Brandon's bad. Why does he get to be free while you might go to jail? The question contained more philosophical weight than Jackson could address, adequately touched on justice's failures in systems limitations, and the complicated arithmetic of legal procedures that didn't align with moral clarity. He settled for honesty rather than comfort, because sometimes the world doesn't work the way it should, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to fix it. They spent an hour in the park, Jackson teaching Lily basic motorcycle maintenance, using his Harley as instructional tool, explaining how engines worked and why chrome needed polishing and what each gauge measured. She absorbed information with intensity that suggested she was studying him as much as the machine, trying to understand what made someone risk everything for a stranger, trying to map the terrain of adult motivations that had proven so confusing and dangerous. Helen watched from a bench, her expression cycling through emotions Jackson couldn't track. When it was time to leave, she approached with the careful movements of someone who'd rehearsed what came next and still felt uncertain. Emma Chen would have my head if she knew I brought Lily here, but she needed to see you, needed to know you're okay, and honestly, I needed to see you too, needed to understand what kind of man does what you did. Jackson waited, understanding that Helen hadn't finished, that something else needed saying. You saved my niece's life. Whatever happens in that hearing, whatever Marcus Webb's lawyers argue, that doesn't change. You're family now, whether you want to be or not. That's how this works. The words landed unexpectedly heavy, carrying weight of commitment Jackson hadn't anticipated. He'd planned to help Lily through immediate crisis to ensure Brandon faced consequences, to step back once official systems took over. But Helen was offering something different: permanent connection, ongoing responsibility, the particular obligations that came from being claimed by people you'd saved. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Linda Marsh calling with news that couldn't wait for scheduled updates. He excused himself and answered, listening, as his attorney explained that the grand jury had moved up their hearing by 2 days, that Marcus Webb had applied pressure somewhere to accelerate timeline, that Jackson needed to appear tomorrow afternoon to testify about events of October 15th. The call ended, and Jackson stood in the park watching Lily play on swings with Helen pushing her higher, listening to the child's laughter carry across the grass like proof that salvation was possible, even when circumstances seemed designed to crush hope. Tomorrow he'd face a grand jury that would decide whether saving a life constituted crime. Tomorrow Marcus Webb's strategy would become clear. Tomorrow the complicated mathematics of justice would reduce to binary outcome: indictment or freedom. But tonight Lily was laughing. Tonight she was safe. Tonight the devil hadn't won. The grand jury hearing took place in the county courthouse, a building constructed in the 1930s, when confidence in American institutions ran higher than current circumstances justified. Jackson entered wearing his dress uniform, the only formal clothes he owned that seemed appropriate for the occasion. Linda had suggested projecting respect for the process, even while challenging its conclusions, had coached him on how to answer questions without volunteering information that could be weaponized. The grand jury consisted of 16 Pinewood residents, none of whom Jackson knew personally, but several he recognized from community events. Their faces showed curiosity and judgment in varying proportions, some clearly skeptical of biker testimony, others appearing open to possibility that circumstances had justified actions. Sarah Whitmore conducted the proceeding with professional detachment, presenting evidence methodically: Lily's medical records, photographs of her injuries, testimony from Doc and Blade about the rescue, Brandon's medical records documenting his injuries, testimony from nurses who treated him. When Jackson took the stand, Whitmore's questions focused on decisions made and force applied. How had he determined Lily needed help? What training qualified him to assess medical emergencies? Why hadn't he simply called police and waited? What specific actions had he taken against Brandon Webb? How much force had been necessary versus chosen? Jackson answered truthfully, aware that any dishonesty would be exposed and used to discredit everything else. He described finding Lily, detailed her physical condition, explained the chain and padlock, outlined the cold temperatures and risk of hypothermia. He acknowledged entering Brandon's trailer without permission, admitted to using force sufficient to restrain an adult male, confirmed that Brandon had sustained injuries during the encounter. Whitmore's final question came loaded with implication. Mr. Cross, you lost your daughter 12 years ago in a car accident. Did that loss influence your response to finding Lily Morgan? The question was designed to establish emotional instability, to suggest Jackson's judgment had been compromised by projection of grief onto inappropriate situation. Linda had prepared him for this, had advised acknowledging connection without conceding that it had impaired his reasoning. My daughter's death taught me that hesitation costs lives. When I saw Lily chained to that tree, I recognized that delay would mean her suffering continued or worsened. So yes, losing Emily influenced my response in that I understood the stakes, but it didn't impair my judgment. It clarified it. The grand jury deliberated for 4 hours longer than Linda had predicted, suggesting genuine debate rather than predetermined outcome. Jackson waited in the hallway with his Chapter 12 men sitting in silence, broken only by occasional murmured conversations and the sound of footsteps echoing through marble corridors. Doc produced a flask of whiskey that they passed around despite prohibition on alcohol in government buildings, small act of defiance that felt necessary. When the grand jury finally returned, their foreman Michael Torres stood and delivered the decision in voice that carried weight of responsibility, reluctantly accepted. No indictment on assault charges. Reasoning given exigent circumstances and clear evidence of ongoing child abuse, defendant's actions, while aggressive, were reasonably necessary to protect a minor in immediate danger. Use of force was proportional to threat posed by Brandon Webb's demonstrated willingness to harm the child. Relief flooded through Jackson like water breaking through a dam. He'd escaped criminal prosecution, avoided the 2 to 5 year sentence Linda had warned was possible. The decision vindicated his actions, confirmed that 12 Montana citizens believed protecting Lily had justified risks he'd taken. But the relief was short-lived because Linda's next words reminded him that one battle won didn't mean the war was over. Marcus Webb's civil suit remained active. Brandon's criminal trial was scheduled for 6 weeks out, and Marcus had already filed motions to exclude Jackson's testimony from that trial, arguing that his involvement as vigilante rather than witness made his statements inadmissible. Outside the courthouse, Marcus waited with reporters and cameras, ready to spin the grand jury decision as system failure rather than justice served. His statement came practiced, calculated to shape public opinion, even if it couldn't influence legal proceedings. This is a miscarriage of justice. My son was brutally assaulted in his own home by men with criminal enterprise histories. The grand jury's decision doesn't change the fact that vigilantism occurred, that the law was taken into private hands, that a dangerous precedent has been set. I will pursue every legal avenue to ensure these individuals are held accountable, and I will fight to protect my grandchild from being influenced by criminals who've escaped prosecution through technicalities. Jackson's response came quiet but firm, delivered to cameras that would broadcast his words across Montana. I do it again, every time, any child, any night. That's not vigilante justice. That's being human. The footage played on local news that evening, setting up the narrative that would dominate Pinewood's conversations for weeks. Were the Iron Thunder members heroes or criminals? Had they saved a life or exceeded authority? Did circumstances justify their actions, or did nothing justify taking law into private hands? The town remained divided, but the grand jury's decision shifted some opinions. People who'd been uncertain found vindication in the official determination that Jackson had acted appropriately. Others dug deeper into opposition, convinced that the grand jury had been manipulated or intimidated, that real justice had been thwarted by public pressure. Jackson returned to the clubhouse as evening fell, exhausted from a day spent navigating legal proceedings and media scrutiny. The chapter had prepared celebration whiskey and steaks and the rough camaraderie of men who'd survived combat together and recognized this as similar victory. But Jackson couldn't fully embrace the relief because Marcus's words echoed in his mind, the promise that this wasn't over, that civil suits and custody battles and public opinion wars would continue until someone surrendered or was destroyed. Blade found him on the clubhouse roof where he'd retreated to process the day's events under stars that had witnessed Montana's human dramas for longer than any of them would live. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence offering solidarity rather than advice. You're thinking it's not enough, that the grand jury decision doesn't protect Lily. Jackson nodded. Marcus is going to use the civil suit to drain our resources to force settlement that includes promises not to testify against Brandon. And if Brandon walks on some technicality, Marcus engineers Lily's never really safe. Not while he's free to come back to threaten to remind her that monsters don't always stay caged. Blade pulled out her phone and showed him something she'd been researching: Marcus Webb's history with the department, the internal affairs investigation that had ended his career, the pattern of complaints from female officers who'd worked under him, the sealed records that suggested his corruption went deeper than anyone had publicly acknowledged. We can't let him win by playing fair. He's not playing fair, so maybe it's time we stop too. The suggestion hung between them, tempting and dangerous, offering path toward justice that would require compromising principles Jackson had built his life around. Fighting Marcus with his own tactics meant becoming the kind of person who destroyed enemies through any means available, who prioritized winning over integrity, who decided that ends justified means when stakes were high enough. Jackson thought about Lily, about her laughter in the park earlier today, about the way she'd hugged him with desperate faith that he'd keep her safe. Thought about Emily, about promises made in cemeteries, about whether the dead cared if you maintained moral purity or just wanted you to protect the living, however necessary. He made his decision, knowing it would cost him, knowing that once you started down certain roads, there was no returning to who you'd been before. But some costs were worth paying. Some children were worth fighting dirty for. Find everything. Whatever Marcus buried, whatever he's afraid people will discover. We're going to war. Brandon Webb's trial began on a Monday morning when December cold had settled over Pinewood like a judgment already rendered. 6 weeks had passed since the grand jury decision, 6 weeks of Marcus Webb working every angle to undermine the case against his son, while Jackson and Blade worked equally hard digging through Marcus's buried secrets. The courthouse filled with spectators, split between those who wanted Brandon imprisoned and those who believed the charges represented overreach enabled by bikers who'd escaped accountability. James Dawson, the prosecuting attorney who'd replaced Whitmore after she recused herself under pressure from both sides, opened with precision that came from 20 years trying child abuse cases. His statement painted Brandon Webb not as troubled addict who'd made isolated mistake, but as serial predator whose violence followed consistent pattern. Medical evidence showed years of abuse. Lily's testimony would demonstrate systematic torture, and new evidence discovered during investigation would prove Brandon had done this before. Richard Carver countered with the narrative Marcus had been cultivating since October. Yes, Brandon struggled with addiction. Yes, he'd made terrible mistakes. But those mistakes had been amplified by vigilantes who'd assaulted him by a system too eager to believe worst, rather than provide treatment by circumstances that prevented fair evaluation of what had actually occurred that night. The real story wasn't about child abuse. It was about how good intentions could create injustice when citizens decided they knew better than the law. Lily's recorded testimony played on day 2, the courtroom falling silent as her voice filled the space. She sat with Dr. Sarah Kim in a room designed to minimize trauma, explaining in careful detail how Brandon's violence had escalated over 18 months. The broken arm from being shoved into the kitchen counter. The hours locked in the closet when she talked back. The night he'd held her hand over the stove burner for 10 seconds because she'd forgotten to take out trash. Each revelation landed like artillery, systematic destruction of Carver's narrative that Brandon was merely flawed rather than monstrous. When asked why she hadn't told anyone, Lily's answer destroyed every adult in the courtroom who'd seen her bruises and looked away. Because telling meant worse things would happen, and nobody ever asked in a way that made me believe they'd actually help. Claire testified on day 3, emerging from Whitefish Recovery Center, where she'd completed 30 days inpatient and transitioned to outpatient therapy. 45 days sober, she looked younger than she had in years. Eyes clear, hands, steady voice carrying shame and determination in equal measure. She admitted to her addiction, described how Brandon had isolated her from Helen, detailed the threats that had kept her compliant. And she acknowledged with tears streaming down her face that she'd chosen pills over protecting her daughter, that no explanation erased that failure that she'd spend the rest of her life trying to earn forgiveness she didn't deserve. Dawson's next witness surprised everyone, including Carver. Sarah Miller's sister, flown in from Washington, testified about how Brandon had brutalized Sarah 3 years ago, how Marcus Webb had threatened Sarah into recanting her statement, how Sarah's suicide note had mentioned Brandon's name, and the specific ways he'd broken her before she'd broken herself. The testimony was devastating, establishing pattern that Carver couldn't dismiss as isolated incident or addiction-fueled mistake. But the revelation that truly destroyed Brandon's defense came from evidence Jackson and Blade had spent 6 weeks uncovering. During search of the trailer following Brandon's arrest, Sheriff Brennan had discovered a locked box hidden beneath floorboards. The box contained photographs of previous victims, locks of hair cut during assault's diary entries, describing violence in disturbing detail, and correspondence with Marcus Webb that demonstrated father and son had been collaborating to evade prosecution for years. Dawson entered the evidence over Carver's strenuous objections, the jury examining photographs that showed Brandon's violence wasn't spontaneous, but ritualized, that he'd documented his crimes like trophies, that the abuse Lily suffered represented refinement of techniques he'd practiced on others. The diary entries were read aloud, Brandon's handwriting describing how he'd learned from his father that powerful men didn't face consequences, that women and children existed to absorb male rage, that documenting victories proved dominance. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted from legal proceeding to something darker: collective recognition that evil was an abstract concept but lived in human bodies that looked ordinary until masks slipped. Several jurors cried openly. The foreman's expression hardened into something that suggested verdict had been decided regardless of what remained in the trial. Marcus Webb fled the courtroom during lunch recess on day 4, understanding that the evidence destroyed any remaining hope his son would escape conviction. Worse, the correspondence revealed his own criminality transformed him from concerned father into accessory who'd spent years enabling predator. Sheriff Brennan issued warrant for Marcus's arrest on charges of obstruction of justice evidence, tampering, and being accessory after the fact to multiple felonies across 3 states. The FBI, which had been monitoring Marcus since internal affairs investigation years earlier, executed arrest warrant that evening. Marcus was found at a motel in Missoula attempting to withdraw funds and disappear across the Canadian border. The arrest played on national news. Former cop, taken down in handcuffs, while trying to flee justice, his son's crimes finally creating consequences Marcus couldn't manipulate away. Jackson watched the footage from the clubhouse, surrounded by his chapter, feeling something like vindication mixed with exhaustion. Marcus Webb's downfall had required resources Iron Thunder couldn't easily spare, had consumed 6 weeks of investigative work that could have been spent on legitimate business, had cost friendships with members who'd questioned whether revenge disguised as justice was worth the price. But Marcus would face trial now, would answer for years of corruption, would spend whatever remained of his life understanding that power wasn't permanent when enough people decided accountability mattered. Brandon's jury deliberated for 90 minutes, returning with verdict everyone anticipated, but that still landed with weight of finality. Guilty on all counts: felony child abuse, false imprisonment, assault. The charges stacked, carrying sentence that could reach 45 years given Brandon's priors and the aggravating factors Dawson had established. Brandon screamed when deputies moved to restrain him, his composure shattering completely, revealing the pathetic creature beneath the predator's mask. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving Judge Rebecca Thornton time to review victim impact statements and pre-sentence reports. Jackson attended the hearing with Lily's permission, Helen bringing the child despite Emma Chen's reservations about exposing her to additional trauma. Lily had insisted she wanted to be present, wanted to see Brandon punished, wanted the closure that came from watching monsters get caged. Helen read a letter Lily had written, the 9-year-old's handwriting unsteady, but message clear. She described her fear, her nightmares, her ongoing struggle to trust adults. She explained that Brandon had taught her the world was cruel and people were dangerous, but that Uncle Rev and his friends had taught her that good people existed too, that help came when you called for it, that strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Claire spoke next, her voice breaking repeatedly, but pushing through. She apologized to Lily, to the court, to everyone who'd tried to help, while Claire had been too broken to accept assistance. She described her recovery, the daily work of staying sober, the therapy sessions where she confronted how completely she'd failed her daughter. And she asked Judge Thornton to impose maximum sentence to ensure Brandon never had opportunity to hurt another child. Jackson spoke last, surprising himself by standing when Thornton asked if anyone else wanted to address the court. He hadn't planned to speak, hadn't prepared remarks, but something about watching Lily grip Helen's hand with white-knuckled intensity compelled him forward. His voice came quiet but carried through the courtroom. Your Honor, I found Lily chained to a tree 6 weeks ago. I've seen combat, witnessed atrocities, buried people I loved. But finding that child in those circumstances was the worst thing I've experienced. Because it was preventable. Because adults saw what was happening and chose comfort over intervention. Brandon Webb is a monster, but he's a monster we allowed to operate because confronting him required courage we didn't possess. He paused, gathering thoughts. I'm not asking for a specific sentence. Whatever you decide, it won't undo Lily's trauma. But it will send a message about whether we value children's safety more than adults' convenience. About whether cruelty has consequences that matter. About whether the system protects the powerless or just the powerful. Judge Thornton listened without expression, then delivered sentence that exceeded Dawson's recommendations. 45 years in state prison, no parole eligibility for 30 years. The charges ran consecutively rather than concurrently, ensuring Brandon would die in prison unless he lived to 80. The gavel came down with finality that made Lily flinch, then relax when she realized the sound represented closure rather than threat. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered, seeking reactions. Lily surprised everyone by asking to speak, Helen initially refusing before Lily's pleading convinced her aunt to relent. The child stood on the courthouse steps, Jackson beside her for support, cameras recording as she delivered statement in voice that trembled but didn't break. Brandon hurt me for a long time. He made me think nobody cared that I deserved what happened. But people did care. They just didn't know how to help until it was almost too late. She looked up at Jackson, her expression carrying trust earned through consistent presence. Uncle Rev showed me that good people exist. That family isn't just who you're born to, but who shows up when you need them. I'm not scared anymore. And I want other kids who are scared to know that help exists if you ask for it. The footage went viral, shared across social media, with commentary praising Lily's courage and questioning how many children suffered silently because adults chose ignorance over action. Pinewood's division over Iron Thunder began shifting public opinion, recognizing that whatever concerns existed about motorcycle clubs paled against results. Lily was alive, Brandon was imprisoned, and maybe bikers understood protection better than people who'd never needed protecting. Marcus Webb's trial followed 3 months later. The charges multiplied after FBI investigation revealed decades of corruption, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, accessory to multiple felonies across 3 states. The case was tried in federal court jurisdiction, expanded because Marcus's crimes had crossed state lines. His attorney attempted familiar defenses. Marcus had been trying to protect his son, hadn't understood the extent of Brandon's crimes, had made mistakes, but not with criminal intent. The prosecution demolished those arguments with evidence Blade and Jackson had helped compile. Recorded phone calls where Marcus threatened witnesses. Financial records showing payments to victims for silence. Testimony from 4 women Brandon had abused, each describing how Marcus had intervened to make charges disappear. And Sarah Miller's suicide note, which specifically named Marcus as reasons she'd recanted, which detailed threats against her family if she persisted with prosecution. The verdict came swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Federal sentencing guidelines imposed mandatory minimums that stacked to 25 years. Marcus Webb, 58 years old, would spend the rest of his life in prison, dying forgotten in a cell far from the town where he'd once wielded power like a weapon. When deputies led him away, he looked at Jackson in the gallery, recognition passing between them that justice had arrived despite Marcus's best efforts to prevent it. Spring transformed Montana from frozen landscape into something alive and promising. 6 months after rescuing Lily, Jackson had established patterns that felt like family even if paperwork didn't confirm it. Every Saturday morning he drove to Helen's house in Kalispell, arriving at 10 with groceries and whatever mechanical expertise Helen's aging sedan required. Lily would run to meet him, her greeting evolving from tentative hugs to enthusiastic tackles that nearly knocked him down. They developed rituals, pancakes for breakfast, using Emily's recipe, the one Jennifer had perfected over years of weekend mornings. Lily helped mix batter while Jackson told stories about his daughter, sharing memories that had been too painful to speak aloud for 12 years. The grief hadn't disappeared, but had transformed into something bearable, made lighter by Lily's laughter, and the recognition that loving one child didn't betray another. After breakfast came motorcycle lessons in Helen's garage, Lily sitting on Jackson's Harley, while he explained maintenance procedures she was too young to execute but absorbed anyway. She'd memorized every part name, understood engine mechanics better than some adults, demonstrated aptitude that suggested genuine interest rather than obligatory attention. Jackson taught her to check oil, adjust mirrors, identify problems from sound alone. Skills she wouldn't use for years, but that created connections stronger than blood. Afternoons they spent drawing Lily's therapy art, evolving from dark images of chains and violences into brighter representations of hope and healing. She drew Iron Thunder members as literal angels with wings and halos, positioning them around a small blonde girl who stood unafraid in fields of wildflowers. Dr. Kim reported that Lily's PTSD symptoms had decreased significantly, that nightmares occurred only occasionally now that the child was learning to trust again, despite every reason to believe adults were dangerous. But progress wasn't linear. Some days Lily regressed, refusing to leave her bedroom, checking locks compulsively, demanding Helen confirm repeatedly that Brandon remained imprisoned. On those days, Jackson simply sat with her, reading aloud from books she'd loved, before trauma taught her fear, maintaining presence without demanding response. Helen watched those interactions and understood that Jackson was healing through helping, that Lily had given him purpose when grief had hollowed him out. Claire completed outpatient treatment in April, 90 days sober, and counting her transformation remarkable to anyone who'd known her during the darkest months. She'd gained weight, color, returning to her face, her eyes sharp instead of glazed. The recovery center had offered her a position as peer counselor, supporting other women navigating addiction while raising children. The work was hard and rewarding. Reminded Claire daily why sobriety mattered, provided community of people who understood that failure wasn't permanent unless you stopped trying. Her relationship with Lily rebuilt gradually supervised visits, transitioning to unsupervised, as Emma Chen's monitoring confirmed Claire's stability. They started with brief encounters, awkward conversations about school and weather that avoided discussing why they'd been separated. But over weeks, honesty crept in. Claire apologized without excuses, admitted failures without minimizing them, explained addiction in terms Lily could process. And Lily, who'd learned through therapy that forgiveness was gift you gave yourself rather than favor you granted. Others slowly began believing her mother could be trusted again. 6 months after the rescue, they spent an afternoon at Riverside Park, the three of them navigating new dynamics. Claire pushed Lily on swings while Helen watched from a bench, ready to intervene if necessary, but increasingly confident intervention wouldn't be required. When Lily skinned her knee-climbing playground equipment, she ran to Claire for comfort, allowing her mother to clean the wound and apply bandage, small act of trust that made Claire cry with relief. Jackson arrived later that afternoon, bringing news that Marcus Webb had been sentenced and that the civil suit had been dismissed with prejudice. Marcus's attorney had withdrawn all charges once it became clear that Marcus's own criminality would be exposed during civil proceedings. Iron Thunder was released from legal jeopardy, free to operate without the shadow of pending litigation. The victory felt hollow given what it had cost, the weeks of resources and energy devoted to fighting when they could have been helping, but it represented closure that allowed moving forward. Lily ran to Jackson with her bandaged knee, explaining in breathless detail how she'd been brave and how Mommy had fixed her and how everything was going to be okay now. Her certainty about that last point, the absolute faith that darkness had ended and light would continue, struck Jackson as simultaneously heartbreaking and inspiring. She'd survived what would destroy many adults and emerged believing the world could be good if good people tried hard enough. Iron Thunder's relationship with Pinewood evolved as Brandon's imprisonment and Marcus's conviction proved that the bikers had been right to intervene. Father Torres invited them to participate in charity events supporting veterans and foster children. Betty expanded her declaration that members ate free to include hosting monthly community dinners at the clubhouse, where families who'd been helped could gather. School board members who'd questioned whether motorcycle club presence around children was appropriate quietly withdrew objections when Lily's teacher reported that the girl spoke constantly about Uncle Rev, teaching her to be strong. The Pinewood Gazette ran a feature article 7 months after the rescue interviewing Jackson, Blade, and Doc about Iron Thunder's history and mission. The piece was surprisingly sympathetic, acknowledging that while motorcycle clubs had complicated reputations, this particular chapter had demonstrated commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. The article mentioned Emily explaining how Jackson's loss had shaped his response to finding Lily, but framing tragedy as catalyst for service rather than evidence of instability. Public opinion shifted measurably after the article published. Townspeople who'd been suspicious began nodding greetings when they encountered club members. Business owners who'd been cool became friendly. Children who'd been taught to fear leather jackets and loud motorcycles began asking parents if they could have their pictures taken with the bikers. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it represented progress, recognition that service and sacrifice mattered more than superficial judgments. Mayor Holden approached Jackson at a town council meeting 8 months after the rescue, her expression carrying something that might have been apology or might have been political calculation. She explained that Pinewood was establishing official partnership between law enforcement and community organizations to improve child welfare outcomes. Would Iron Thunder consider participating, providing emergency response when CPS received reports of abuse, offering mentorship to at-risk youth? Jackson agreed, understanding that official recognition meant accountability, but also legitimacy, that partnership with the town meant Iron Thunder's protective mission would be supported rather than suspected. The agreement was formalized at a ceremony. Sheriff Brennan organized photographs taken of Jackson and Holden. Shaking hands, symbolic gesture that the town's division had begun healing even if scars remained. Lily's 9th birthday arrived in October, exactly 1 year after the night that had changed everything. Helen and Claire organized a party at the clubhouse, inviting Iron Thunder members and their families, Dr. Kim, Sheriff Brennan, Father Torres, Betty, and Lily's school friends. The space filled with people who'd been touched by Lily's story, who'd learned through her survival that courage came in unexpected forms, and that family was built through choice rather than imposed through biology. Decorations transformed the clubhouse from masculine space, smelling of motor oil, into something almost magical. Purple and silver balloons, Lily's favorite colors, covered every surface. A banner reading "Happy Birthday to our brave little sister" hung across the main room. Tables overflowed with food. Betty had prepared enough to feed twice the attendees, her expression making clear that excess was intentional, that celebration required abundance after so much scarcity. Lily arrived wearing the leather jacket Blade had given her 6 months earlier, the one with angel wings embroidered on the back, her pride in the garment obvious in how she stood straighter when wearing it. She'd grown since October, gained weight, and height lost the haunted quality that had made her seem older than her years. Now she looked like what she was, a 9-year-old girl who'd survived trauma but refused to be defined by it. Presents accumulated on a table designated for gifts, each representing someone's investment in Lily's future. Helen gave her a laptop for schoolwork and writing supporting Lily's announcement that she wanted to be a therapist who helped scared kids. Claire gave her a locket containing photographs of Lily with Chad, the father who died too young, and Claire herself sober and smiling. Dr. Kim gave her a journal with inscription encouraging Lily to document her journey. Sheriff Brennan gave her an honorary junior deputy badge. Father Torres gave her a children's Bible with note explaining that faith meant believing things would improve even when evidence suggested otherwise. Iron Thunder's collective gift was presented by Jackson, his hands steadier than they'd been in years, his voice carrying emotion he no longer tried to hide. He handed Lily a large box, the contents carefully wrapped. Inside, she found custom leather jacket, size for a child, brown, with white angel wings embroidered on the back like Blade's original gift, but more elaborate, more detailed, clearly expensive, and made specifically for her. Beneath the jacket was a silver pendant engraved with ITC and the date October 15th, reminder of the night that had simultaneously been worst and best of her life. Jackson's explanation came quietly. "This means you're part of our family, forever. No matter what happens, you've got 12 uncles and everyone who rides with us. You need help, you call. You're scared, we come. That's what this jacket means." Lily put on the jacket, carefully, fingers tracing the embroidery, then threw herself at Jackson with force that nearly knocked him off balance. He caught her holding tight, and for a moment the crowded room faded away. Just a man and a child, both carrying losses, both learning that healing happened through connection rather than isolation. When Lily finally pulled back, she climbed onto a chair, wanting to address the assembled crowd. Her voice came stronger than it had on the courthouse steps, confidence built through months of therapy and support. "A year ago, I was chained to a tree. I thought I was going to die. I thought no one cared." She paused, scanning faces of people who'd proved that assumption wrong. "But then I heard motorcycles. And Uncle Rev found me. He saved my life. But he did more than that. He taught me that the world has good people, that family isn't just who you're born to, that strong people protect weak people." Her words echoed what Jackson had told her that night in October, lessons she'd absorbed and was now teaching back. "So thank you. Uncle Rever, Aunt Helen, my mom who's trying so hard, all the Iron Thunder angels, Dr. Kim, everyone who helped me. I'm not scared anymore, because I know you'll all come running if I ever need help again." The room erupted in applause, several people crying openly, the emotional weight of watching a child transform from victim to survivor to advocate too powerful to contain. Jackson felt something release in his chest. 12 years of carrying Emily's death like punishment, finally recognized as catalyst for helping others, permission to remember his daughter with joy instead of just grief. Blade approached as the party continued, her expression carrying question she'd been holding back. "You good seeing Lily like this, knowing you made the difference?" Jackson watched Lily across the room, laughing with friends from school, behaving like the child she should have been allowed to be all along. "I'm good, better than I've been since Jennifer and Emily died. Turns out saving one person doesn't replace losing another, but it proves that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story." The party lasted hours, sunlight fading to dusk, to darkness, while celebration continued. When guests finally departed, leaving Jackson and Lily and Helen to clean up, the girl was exhausted but radiant, the kind of tired that came from joy rather than fear. She fell asleep on the clubhouse couch, Jackson's leather jacket covering her like a blanket, that leather and chrome could represent safety as readily as steel bars and alarm systems. 7 years passed with speed that seemed impossible when living them, but obvious when looking back. Lily grew from traumatized 9-year-old into confident 16-year-old high school junior with straight grades and college plans. She'd maintained therapy with Dr. Kim sessions, transitioning from weekly to monthly to as needed, the relationship evolving from treatment into mentorship. The nightmares had faded years ago, replaced by dreams about normal teenage concerns, exams, friendships, the college applications she'd started preparing. Her relationship with Claire had fully healed, the two living together in a small apartment in Kalispell, proximity to Helen, allowing continued support while establishing independence. Claire remained sober 7 years in counting her work at the recovery center, saving lives the way Iron Thunder had saved hers. Mother and daughter had learned to talk honestly, to acknowledge past without living there, to build present that honored truth while reaching toward better future. Jackson had officially adopted two other foster children during those years, boys aged 12 and 14 when they'd arrived, both survivors of abuse who needed what Jackson had learned to provide: consistent presence, patient guidance, demonstration that adult men could be trustworthy. He'd become father again without replacing Emily, proved that hearts expanded rather than divided when love was offered freely. Lily visited every weekend, still the tradition established 7 years ago maintained despite teenage social demands. She'd learned to ride motorcycles, getting her license on her 16th birthday, Jackson teaching her with same patience he'd shown during those early Saturday maintenance lessons. She wrote a smaller Harley custom-painted purple and silver gift from the entire chapter for surviving what would have destroyed many people. On a Saturday in July, 7 years and 9 months after the rescue, Lily sat at her desk working on an essay for college applications. The prompt asked about an experience that shaped her worldview, and she'd chosen to write about the night she'd been chained to a tree and the people who'd saved her. The essay described darkness and fear and the sound of motorcycle engines arriving like mechanical angels. It detailed Jackson's gentleness, the way he'd knelt to her level, the promise he'd made that she was safe now. But the essay focused less on rescue than on what came after: the slow work of healing, the therapy sessions, where Dr. Kim taught her that trauma didn't define her, the Saturdays with Jackson learning about motorcycle maintenance, and Emily's memory, the months of rebuilding trust with Claire. The essay argued that heroism wasn't single dramatic action, but sustained commitment to showing up, that strength meant continuing when easier path involved giving up. She finished the draft and printed it, folding the pages into an envelope addressed to Iron Thunder Motorcycle Club, Pinewood Chapter. Inside, she included a letter she'd been composing mentally for weeks, trying to capture what Jackson meant to her, what the entire chapter represented in her life. The letter began simply, "Dear Uncle Revim," and then it poured out 7 years of gratitude, the acknowledgement that she'd survived because strangers had decided her life mattered more than their convenience. The explanation that she was going to college to study psychology because he'd taught her that helping people was life's highest calling. She described how she'd learned to recognize red flags in relationships, how she'd intervened when seeing friends in situations that suggested abuse, how she'd become advocate for children who needed voices when their own were silenced by fear. She sealed the envelope and drove to Pinewood, her Harley eating highway miles with ease born from practice. The clubhouse looked the same as it had 7 years ago, familiar and welcoming, decorated with photographs that now included her image alongside founding members. She found Jackson inside working on an engine with Doc, their easy companionship demonstrating brotherhood built through shared purpose. When Jackson saw her, his expression transformed from concentration to joy, the look he reserved for moments when Lily appeared unexpectedly. She handed him the envelope, explaining that it contained her college essay and a letter she'd been meaning to write for years. He read both while she waited, his eyes welling with tears he didn't bother hiding. After finishing, he pulled her into a hug, the kind that communicated what words couldn't adequately express. "I'm so damn proud of you. Emily would have loved you, would have been proud to call you sister." Lily held tight, understanding that Jackson was offering the highest compliment he possessed, that being compared to his daughter meant she'd earned place in the part of his heart he'd thought was closed forever. "I'm proud of you too, for saving me, for teaching me what it means to be strong." They sat on the clubhouse steps, watching sunset over mountains that had witnessed their journey from rescue to family, talking about college plans and motorcycle trips. and the work Iron Thunder continued doing for children who needed protection. A call came through on the club's emergency line report from CPS about a 6-year-old boy in a situation that sounded familiar. Suspected abuse, unresponsive parents, neighbors reporting concerns. They were too afraid to act on themselves. Jackson stood signaling to the others the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before and would do it again. 12 motorcycles engines firing in sequence riders, mounting with expressions that combined determination and compassion. This was what they did. This was why they existed. Some people went to work and came home and never confronted suffering beyond their own circles. Iron Thunder ran towards suffering, understood that turning away meant letting evil win by default. Lily watched them prepare, recognizing the ritual from 7 years ago when she'd been the child needing rescue. When Jackson's arrival had represented salvation, she'd stopped believing possible. Now she understood the full picture, saw how her rescue had been beginning of something larger, how Jackson's promise to Emily had expanded to include every child who called out in darkness, hoping someone would hear. Before mounting his bike, Jackson turned back to Lily, his expression carrying question that had been building for weeks. "You want to ride with us? Not tonight, but eventually. Join the chapter when you're 18. Help save kids the way we saved you." The offer landed heavy with significance, invitation into brotherhood that had defined Jackson's adult life proposal, that she transformed from recipient of help into provider of it. Lily considered carefully, weighing college plans against calling. She'd felt growing stronger each year, understanding that becoming therapist would help people, but joining Iron Thunder would save lives immediately. Her answer came certain, no hesitation. "Yes, I want to ride with you." Want to be there when the next scared kid hears motorcycles and thinks maybe they're not alone after all? Jackson nodded, his smile carrying pride and recognition that the cycle was continuing, that trauma transformed into purpose, could break generational patterns, that saving one person created ripples, extending beyond immediate circumstances. He climbed on his Harley, the engine roaring to life, 12 riders pulling out of the parking lot in formation. Lily watched them disappear toward highway red taillights, fading into dusk, the sound of engines rolling across valley like thunder, promising rain. She thought about the little boy they were riding toward, about how his life was about to change, about the moment when he'd hear motorcycles and realize that help had arrived, even though he hadn't known who to call or whether anyone cared enough to answer. She pulled out her phone and composed a text to Claire. "They're heading out on a rescue. Same thing they did for me 7 years ago. I'm riding with them next time." Claire's response came immediately. "I know you are, baby. You were born for this. Make us proud." The words settled over Lily like blessing permission from the mother who'd failed her to become the person who wouldn't fail others, to transform survival into service, to prove that darkness didn't win when good people decided showing up mattered more than staying comfortable. Lily remained on the clubhouse steps until full dark stars emerging overhead, the same stars that had witnessed her chained to a tree 7 years ago, that had watched Jackson find her, that had seen everything that followed. The valley below sparkled with lights from Pinewood small town that had divided over her rescue and eventually united in recognition that protecting children justified uncomfortable interventions. Somewhere out there, Iron Thunder was pulling up to a house where a child was suffering, where parents had failed, where neighbors had noticed but chosen silence. The boy would be scared when leather-clad men appeared, wouldn't understand initially that salvation came in unexpected forms. But Jackson would kneel down, would use the voice that had promised Lily safety, would make the same commitment he'd made 7 years ago. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you anymore." And the cycle would continue. Rescue leading to healing, leading to purpose, trauma transformed into determination that others wouldn't suffer similarly. Each child saved becoming potential angel for the next person who called out, hoping someone would hear. It was the best kind of legacy, the only kind that mattered. Using your worst experiences to ensure others had better ones, turning pain into protection, making sure that when children whispered into darkness, somebody answered. Lily started her motorcycle and rode home, the engine's rumble, a constant reminder of what motorcycles meant in her life. Not danger or threat or rebellion like popular culture suggested, but rescue and family and commitment to showing up when needed. She'd been saved by angels who rode Harleys, and in 2 years she'd join them, would add her voice to the thunder that rolled through valleys, carrying promise that help existed if you were brave enough to ask. Some stories don't begin with screams. They begin with silence that follows them. But the best stories, the ones worth telling, are about how that silence gets broken by people who refuse to let suffering continue unchallenged, who understand that indifference is violence's greatest ally, who show up when called, even though showing up costs everything. 7 years ago, Lily Morgan had been chained to a tree in Montana, darkness, dying slowly from cold and fear, and the certainty that nobody cared. Then she'd heard motorcycles. And everything changed, not immediately, not magically, but steadily through the sustained effort of people who decided her life mattered more than their convenience, who transformed her. From victim into survivor into advocate. And now, somewhere in Pinewood, another child was hearing motorcycles and learning the same lesson Lily had learned: angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they have engines and leather jackets and scars from their own battles. Sometimes they're just people who got tired of watching the devil win, who decided that showing up was the minimum requirement for being human, who understood that family meant choosing who to protect rather than waiting for blood to dictate obligation. The night stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and purpose, and the particular satisfaction that came from transforming survival into service. Iron Thunder rode towards someone who needed them, carrying the weight of promises made and kept, of children, saved, of lives rebuilt from ashes. And behind them, Lily Morgan rode home, already planning for the day she joined them would become the thunder that rescued. Someone else would prove that chains could be broken, and monsters could be caged, and silence could be shattered by people who cared enough to listen. Wrong number 7 years ago had become right answer. Tragedy had transformed into triumph. And the cycle continued, angels riding through darkness toward anyone brave enough to whisper into the night, hoping someone would hear and decide their suffering mattered enough to intervene. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was what it meant to turn trauma into purpose, to ensure that your worst experiences prevented others from suffering similarly, to prove that even in darkness, even when hope seemed impossible, thunder could arrive carrying salvation on two wheels. The end was really just another beginning. The next chapter already written in the sound of engines heading towards someone who needed help, in the promise that Iron Thunder would keep showing up, in the certainty that Lily Morgan had survived her darkness and would spend the rest of her life making sure others survived theirs. Some stories end with silence. This one ended with thunder rolling across Montana valleys, promising that help existed if you were brave enough to ask, that angels came when called. Even if they looked nothing like what you expected, that family was built through choice and sustained through commitment and proven through presence when presence cost everything. The motorcycles disappeared into night, their taillights like stars fallen to earth, their purpose as clear as the promise Jackson had made 7 years ago to a child chained to a tree: "You're safe now. We've got you, and we're never letting go."